Hi, everyone. Well, thanks for joining us. It is my pleasure to introduce Angela Blackwell, the founder and resident of PolicyLink. Thanks for joining us, Angela.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I just want to start out by understanding a little bit about PolicyLink. So can you describe for us what PolicyLink is and also why you started it?
PolicyLink is a research and action institute advancing racial and economic equity. I started PolicyLink 22 years ago, and the purpose was to be able to influence policy from the wisdom, voice, and experience of people who were working for change in their local communities. There are a lot of national policy groups out there, but most of them are based in DC, and they work with the rhythm and the style of policy in DC. My experience doing a bunch of other things before I started PolicyLink was that people in local communities, organizers, residents, service providers, people in local government are very creative when it comes up to solving problems. But the world of national policy gets done at some distance from them. I really thought that local leaders are national leaders. They're solving the nation's problems, and we ought to be doing policy from their point of view. That's why I started it.
Okay, that's really interesting. I like that approach. And I'm wondering how, as you go about doing this, I'm kind of jumping ahead of where I was going to go because I really love that introduction. How political is your work on policy? So you're saying it's not DC, but some of the things that you're interested in are really high level problems that are addressed both locally, but with implications for national policy. So how do you manage the politics of, say, putting together a coalition of people to support the policies you're interested in?
Well, policy and politics really go together because good ideas that develop into good policy initiatives aren't going to get put in place if you don't get the politics of how change happens. You've got to convince the people who have the power that this is what needs to happen. And just having an elegant policy idea is not going to necessarily move it forward. People in local communities understand that too, because when you get something in place in a local community, often the community has come out at a school board meeting or at a city council. And that kind of organizing really does work. Too often, it's the lobbyists who are moving things in DC. And we actually think that that same organizing that works in local communities is important at the national level, which is one of the reasons, just to jump right into the moment, Black Lives Matter organizing has done more to push forward conversations about police and reparations and work and housing than all of the elegant policy ideas coming out of those think tanks. And so I think that people who are trying to deal with racial equity, and when I talk about equity, I'm always talking about racial equity because that's the crux of a lot of the inequity. People who deal with racial equity are really understanding that you have to put it all together. We need the data, we need the policy development, we need the politics, we need the people who sit in the halls of power, but we also need the people on the ground who understand their issues to be in it and stay in it.
Mm-hmm. And at first, I think you're right about race, right? And anything in this country that has a social implications is tied to race in one way or the other, I think. So this is why it's a really important topic to discuss. You use the word equity. So I'm curious, how do you distinguish between equity and equality? That's come up quite a bit in the sessions we've had thus far. I'd love to hear you talk about the difference.
It was actually in 1998 that I first started PolicyLink. We moved into the office in January of 1999. But before that, in the mid-90s, I had been working at the Rockefeller Foundation. I was the senior vice president. One of the things I noticed there, and before that I'd been doing organizing and public interest law and other things, but one of the things I noticed at the Rockefeller Foundation, which is known for its international work, is in the international work, they use the language of equity. And in their domestic equal opportunity work, they use the language of equality and equal opportunity. I was struck by that the moment I walked into the place and tried to figure out why are people using this different language? And I pulled together a working group around equity and why aren't we using that language domestically? I became so convinced that equity was the word that we needed to be using within the United States as we were trying to build a fully inclusive society. And I contrast that with equality. With equality, like just take education. That when people talk about equality in education, I think what they have in mind is that children ought to go to school for the same amount of time. use books with the same kind of curriculum, have teachers with the same training, and hope and wish for equal outcomes. What equity asks is, what's the outcome? We want all children to achieve at high levels, graduate, and go on to reach their full potential. Once you know what that outcome is and you say all children, you then back into what the inputs have to be. So equity really focuses on the difference between where you are and where you want to be, without getting so caught in equality that you might miss the equity goal altogether. But you think about those same children. Some children who live in communities that have suffered from underinvestment don't have the kind of things that upper class communities have in terms of parks and stimulating activities and parents that can connect them both by money and networks to everything they need. If that's what's needed to reach your full potential, and some children don't have it, then the government needs to ask, how do we make sure they get it? What do we need in terms of health services, in terms of access to the arts and culture, access to mentors and other things that might be useful? So I think that the equity discussion really takes the civil rights movement to the next level. To once you remove the legal barriers and once you've set up a standard that people ought to be able to reach their full potential, you need a framework that actually allows us to say, well, what does that take? How are we advocates for it? And how do we get policy aligned with it?
I can't help myself. I have to jump forward almost to the end now and
Okay.
say, are we ready for that? Because here's what you're saying. Here's what I hear. You tell me if I'm wrong. Here's what I hear. There are inequities in the society. I don't think anyone, any reasonable person can look around in this country and not see that. So let's just take that as a given. And it's the role of the society or the government to address those. That's what I think I hear you saying. And to do that, what that means is providing more for some than others, because some people need more to achieve their full potential. And it's the role of the society and via the government, as what I assume you're saying, to provide that kind of possibility. Are we ready for that?
You know, 20 years ago when we started PolicyLink, nobody was ready for it. I can't tell you the amount of pushback that we got just putting that word and that definition out there. We got it from philanthropy, we got it from business, we got it from government, we got it from academics. We even got it from peers who wanted to know, well, what do we need new language for? We haven't achieved equal opportunity. Let's focus on that. Mm-hmm. What's happened in the past 20 years is pretty astonishing. What's happened in the past 20 weeks is pretty astonishing. That we have gotten to a point in this country where a lot of the leadership from all those quarters is actually calling for, ready for, trying to lean into and figure out how to be part of the equity movement. And they're talking about it in exactly that way. What has happened is that people are starting to understand that the fate of the nation is dependent on getting equity right. I'll tell you what I mean. As we become a nation in which the majority will be people of color by 2044, that's actually after the fact, because by 2030, the majority of the young workforce will be of color. This year, the majority of all children 18 or under are now of color: Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, mixed. What that means is that the fate of the nation is dependent on the very people who have been disproportionately left behind. If we don't have a democracy that works in the context of difference, it is not a democracy worth standing on the world stage saying you have something to be proud of. This country has really been known for its vast, stable, and growing middle class. If people of color don't become the middle class, there will be no vast, stable, and growing middle class. The diversity that is this nation is actually a gift, because what could be more valuable in a global economy than to have a world population that is related to the globe by kinship, by custom, by language? And so while when we were talking about equity as the right thing to do, you attract a certain number of people who are attracted to every movement that is the right thing to do. And maybe you get a few more when you put a different spin on it. But when you think about where we are now, it's an imperative. It's a democratic imperative. It is an economic imperative. It is a national imperative. And I am here to tell you that business leaders, government leaders, philanthropic leaders, civic leaders get it. And I can't find enough time in the day to talk to all the people who will suddenly want to know about racial equity and how to get some.
Okay. All right. Look, I'm going to tell you right now, I love the optimism and energy. I'm not sure I'm convinced yet, but I love it. Right. So I want to come back to that though. I mean, this is really important. So I want to come back to it, but let me go into some local things for a bit. So we have a number, as always, propositions on the ballot in California because we do direct referendum, right? Popular referendum. And I'm curious to hear your thinking about two in particular. So I'd love for you to give a quick description of Proposition 16 that's on the ballot and tell us where your organization is on that proposition.
PolicyLink has actually put out a voter's guide on some of these, and they are for, and I am for 16. 16 actually allows for us to be able to undo the discrimination that is taking place by putting back in place things like affirmative action that actually allow for taking race into account as we're looking at higher education, as we're looking at contracting opportunities, we're looking at decision making. We actually some time ago made a big mistake in California when we pulled back on affirmative action, and we're suffering for it. If you think about it, think about California after World War II. California after World War II was a place where you had all of these immigrants who were coming to California. They were undereducated, they were not healthy, they didn't have a lot going for them. They were white. And California invested in these white people who had little education, deep poverty, not that much in way of health, had high infant mortality rates. They invested in the people who were here. And California ended up by 1962 being on the front cover of Newsweek magazine, booming, bustling California, the nation's #1 state with an educational system, a healthcare system, and infrastructure unrivaled in the nation. They took what they had and they invested in it. And they got great results. As people began to age and the population began to change a little bit, we pulled back. We pulled back and we stopped being aggressive about reaching out and making sure that the people who were coming in to be the next one would have the investment they need. Prop 16, and you haven't asked me about it yet, but Prop 16 and Prop 15 actually go very much together. They both represent a pull up the ladder mentality. They both represent that. Having put your resources and your energy and your policy creativity out there to be able to help one group of people and then pulling back when another group of people were just starting to get a toehold because of affirmative action, just starting to get the education and the infrastructure, benefit from infrastructure and health, pull back. And so California's got to step into the moment. It'll be glad that it did when it doesn't, but we're having to bring them kicking and screaming.
Okay, yeah, so this is really about repealing Prop 209, the original proposition that repealed affirmative action, right? So for that. Okay, and what about Proposition 22? This one is I think, probably more complicated for you as well. So Proposition 22, can you describe the basics of that proposition for us?
Yeah, 16 is not complicated at all. Given the population in California, we need to be able to consciously reach out to those people who are going to be the future and invest in them so that all of California can benefit. That's straightforward. 22 is more complicated. We have, through technology, changed the nature of work in the economy. The economy actually doesn't provide the kind of safeguards of employment that it once did. You know, I know when I was a girl, people got a job and they kept that job and they retired from that job. It's way different now. People have the difficult time making ends meet. Low wage work, entry-level jobs, frontline workers, they don't make enough to really support a family, particularly not in areas like the Bay Area and Los Angeles and areas of California that are expensive, but it hardly supports you anywhere. And so at the same time that the economy had changed, kind of pulling out so many of the safeguards that people had depended on, we had some opportunities emerge through this app-based work, Uber, Lyft, things like that. And what these things actually do is they make money off of people's labor, but don't employ them as employees. They are totally dependent on their labor. totally dependent on people driving their cars, but don't employ them as employees. They are able to bypass our labor laws and say they're contracting with people. We had Prop 5, I guess it was, or that actually said that you had to treat these people who were employed through these app-based jobs as employees with all the benefits of employment. 22 snatches that away. 22 snatches that away. And I'm sure the public is confused because you see all these people on the television commercials about 22 saying, don't take my job away. It's my extra job. I've got one job and I just do this on the side. I'm a student and I'm just doing this to make a little spending change. Well, a whole lot of people in California are doing it to make a living, to support their families. They want to work more hours. They want to work steady hours. They want to have benefits. They want to be able to have those things that come with secure employment. And that is why we think that we need to vote no on 22. We need to keep the labor laws applying to these app-based businesses. And no on 22 does that.
Mm-hmm. So what's interesting about this one is you have a number of organizations that I think would agree with you on many things, right? So you have, I think it's last I looked, maybe 10 chapters of the NAACP, national Asian American organizations, and a number of others that are interested in racial justice that are yes on 22. So I wonder, like, what do you think about that? How do you make sense of that? Because again, I assume that you agree in terms of the goals that these organizations are trying to achieve, but there's differences in how you all are reading this proposition. What do you make of that?
I am not sure that all of the organizations that are saying that you should be yes on 22 fully understand that the exceptions are driving a lot of that chatter about, I just want to be able to do this on the side. Many people who say, I just want to do it on the side, have not allowed themselves to envision work as it ought to be. That you could make this your work if you had regular hours that you could depend on. And if you made it your work and you had health benefits and you had time off and you had family leave, you could really be making a living. We have gotten so sucked in to these jobs that you have to have 3 or 4 of them to be able to piece together a living wage. People have just gotten so into that, they're afraid to give up one of those pieces, as opposed to fighting to make a piece what could be your whole job. And so we have a culture that has just gotten accepting of an economy that does not work. We need to fight against that. And I will give some credit to some organizations who want to represent people who say, this is my livelihood. I understand that. But in order to be able to build the economy that we need for the future that we've been talking about, we're going to have to push back on some of these employers, that the exploitation is really awful. You know, we talk about extractive work, that we extract from the soil. We're extracting from people in ways that are just so unfair. I will tell you, I always talk. I admit, I take Uber and I take Lyft, and I always talk to my Uber and Lyft drivers. I always talk to them because I want to know who they are and what life is like. I talked to a woman who told me, this is exactly what she told me, that she drives 13 to 15 hours a day, and she lives in her car in a parking lot. That's the worst story that I've heard, but I have heard similar stories from a lot of people when I've gotten in their cars. This is no way to live. We need to demand more of the corporations that are making huge dollars off of the labor of people who are desperate to make ends meet.
Yeah, I see that. And I also see an interesting distinction between the people who would be a yes and a no here, right? So there are people who would be focused on the immediate jobs, right? They may not be great, but I need something, right? I hear what you're saying. I agree with you, but I got to eat today. And today, this is providing me enough to get something to eat, right? And what you're talking about, I think, is a longer term kind of, a labor movement, a focus on the relationship between labor and capital. Like, what kind of society do we want? But if I were going to be on the other side of that, I would say, like, it's a little paternalistic for us to tell people what they should want or need. If they want this job and they need this job, we should have those options available to them. And to take them away is, you know, this is how people push against the liberal position, right? It's a paternalistic approach to people's lives, right? We're just telling them what's best for them. And if you get on board with what we're selling, your life is going to be better, but in the short term, it might hurt a little bit, but it's good for you. Is how, yeah, how do you think about that?
I think it is the job of government to be able to put together systems in which people can live their lives. And those systems have to be guided by some principles. And when you're talking about principles, there are going to be some people who don't want to be bothered with that. They want to live on the outside of that. But what government has to do is it has to look at the overall picture. It has to say, these are the things that are going to guide our role in terms of governance and governing, in terms of policy and strategy. And I think that we need to get back in that business when it comes to our economy. Our economy is failing the American people. And you don't have to you don't have to go too far. You don't have to talk to too many people before you will get reinforcement for that. There are people who have no security about their housing, no security about food, no security about their health. And the economy is just moving in a direction that it is failing people. We need to begin to think about, how do we get this economy working again? How do we get the people who are making the big bucks? How do we get the companies that represent the future to understand this isn't just about how much wealth you can extract, but how do we build a system that is sustainable going forward? And in building that system, there are going to be some people who are going to fall on the outside of it in terms of what they want. But we can't create a system that allows for the people who want something slightly different to be able to control what it is in terms of standards and principles that we're applying as we try to govern through policy.
I hear you, and I'm going to now push back on your optimism because I like it, but I'm not completely convinced yet. So the economy is developing, as you pointed out. The gig economy has, exploded over the last, I don't know, whatever it's 5-10 years. There's some thinking that we're moving toward automation, like self-driving cars, which will concentrate presumably capital in even fewer hands because they won't even need the drivers. And you're talking about creating a fair system. This is a large thing to address, right? How do you think about changing the whole system, right? So, and the reason I'm bringing this up is you talk about the difference between revolution and evolution, right? This is the language that you use. Tell me what this revolution looks like.
Well, this is an extraordinary moment that we're in right now. And you're right in seeing my optimism, but I also am not naive. I know that this moment could pass without any measurable change happening. And so I think it is up to those of us who see a way forward to figure out how to stretch this moment into a movement that leads to something transformative. And it will be good for vast numbers of people, because what the people who have been disproportionately left behind need is for the system to work. We can just take one system after another. Take education. Anybody who looks at the education data knows that our education system on a whole is failing. It doesn't mean it's failing everybody in it, but on a whole, it doesn't look good when you compare it with other countries and you think about what it is that we need. Some people are doing very well within it. And so we could just keep focusing on the people who are able to benefit from the schools that are good and keep improving their schools so that they will go on and be very good. Or we could focus on those who are in the schools that are getting the least, that aren't performing at all. And I feel quite confident that if we focus on those with the least and we fix the system from there forward, everybody will benefit. Because what those children need is a 21st century education, and they need it now. What they need is a system that's anticipating the workforce of the future, and they need to be ready for that now. They need to be able to unleash their extraordinary potential because they are the future. They are the entrepreneurs. They are the business people. They need to be able to tap into that. The society will benefit from their skill, from their business acumen, from their creativity, from their contribution. And it will help those for whom schools were always working because they will continue to work. So what we need to do is make sure that we fix our educational system, and we don't have forever to do it because these children are here now. We need to work on that in a way that is very fast. Let's talk about police. That's another system that is broken. It is broken, though, in an odd way. It is not working for the communities that are in most need of safety and protection. Actually, it may work pretty well for people who are affluent and they live in communities where they combine their paid security guards with the police. It may work there, but it is not working for the people who actually are most dependent on it. And when I say it's not working, I mean it's not creating safety, because the sad truth is that the systems are doing actually what they were developed to do: control and contain. Control and contain the people who are poor, the people who have not, and protect private property and people who have. They actually are doing that pretty well, but there's so many people who they're trying to control and contain. There's such vastness in terms of the people who are being left behind that it's just not working anymore, even for those goals. And it's certainly not working for the people who want their communities to be safe. Now, we need to fix it, and we need to fix it now. I don't think that we're going to fix it with minor reform. I actually started working on police reform when I was at Public Advocates in 1977. That's more years than I can add up just like that. It's a long time that I have been working on police reform. And I've tried community policing, I've tried training, tried all kinds of things. And it hasn't worked. We need to do something transformative with the police. And so when I talk about the need for revolution, what I am really saying is we need to have a different North Star in terms of where we're trying to go. And we need to have a well-funded, radically imagined policy strategy approach to getting what we need. And I really don't think that this is the time for small incremental change. This is the time to take advantage of a shift in the mindset of the American people to be able to put out some big ideas and see where we land.
Mm-hmm. And so when you talked about both education and policing, what struck me is they both seem not to work. So I'm compelled by that argument, but they serve the interests of the powerful pretty well. Like that's what's implied, right? You didn't use that language exactly, but I think that's what you're saying. And so when we go back and we say, what's the relationship between policy and politics, right? If we think politics is the practice of power to some extent, like who gets to make the decisions and whose interests? And we see these things that we think are fundamentally broken, but not for the powerful. This is where I just want to be clear. That's where my concern or pessimism comes in, right? This is a political solution through policy, and politics are about power, and these things that are broken in the ways you're describing actually serve the powerful. So help me get on board with your enthusiasm, with your optimism about that.
I think that you're realistic when you point out that we have to overcome the power that has put in place what we have. But what we know is the power really is with the people when they embrace it, when they use it, when they act on it. That even when we use politics to get people in place who we think share our worldview, they don't produce what we want if the people don't demand it and keep demanding it. We have had times when we have had people in office and they have disappointed us because we have disappointed ourselves. We have let them disappoint us. We sometimes think that when we elect somebody who's of our mindset, we can just sit back and go play pool. We can't. We got to stay active. We have to keep organizing. We have to keep an eye on them. We need to have some standards and markers for what it is we want them to do. We need to hold them accountable. These things only work when they work together. Having the right person in office does not produce the result that we want if the people don't keep demanding that result. Having the right person in office without good creative policy ideas that are transformative will not produce the results that we want. Having the right people in offices, having the best policies in place, we won't get where we want to go if we don't really put enough money behind it. How many times, Jeff Canada is a friend of mine. Jeff Canada from the Harlem Children's Zone, and he and his colleagues at the Harlem Children's Zone have proven that when you invest holistically in children, no matter how poor they are, no matter what color they are, they will produce at high levels, not just average levels, but at high levels. They have proven it. He has been in the movies, Waiting for Superman. His program has been well funded. It has been researched by researchers at Harvard that say this is an amazing program. And yet, we have not done that for every child in America, and there's no excuse for it. We know what works, but we don't have the political will to invest in it. So that even when you get somebody in office like President Obama, who was impressed with the Harlem Children's Zone and put forward a program called Promise Neighborhoods, it was nickel and dimed and didn't get the resources that it needed, and it's almost faded away. And so we've got to have the good ideas. We have to have the North Star. We have to have the politicians. We have to have an organized community. We have to measure progress and change, and we have to hold the system accountable.
Great. Yeah, I hear you. And just quick plug, so people don't know who Canada is, there's a book, Whatever It Takes by Paul Tuft, that goes into all the details of his work in Harlem on that school zone. Right? So if people are interested in that, they should check that out. What I would say is, I hear you on all this, and I'm on board with that. And I just wonder, like right now, for example, we have the presidential election coming up, and Biden, who I assume is like more aligned with what your interests than Trump would be. He still is very tentative on some of the things that you talk about as revolution, right? And this is my reading, I'll just say this is my reading. And this is where I wonder about the pragmatics versus the revolutionary, right? That he is trying to get elected, that he is, on policing, for example, you brought up the policing. He's tentative on police reforms for reasons that I think are understandable, whether we agree with them or not, but you understand why he would be, I assume. Like, how do you create revolution in this context?
Well, I think that one of the ways is to be comfortable with your role. I have never been in elected office. I've never been on the school board or the city council or anything. I can't tell you how many times I've been approached by it. And I have always said no, because I want to do what I do. And what I do is try to tell the truth, try to understand the truth deeply, try to think about what would make a difference, not what can we get, not what's going to be popular, but what would make a difference. And once I can identify that, and I don't do that sitting in a room alone, I do that in constant contact and dialogue and working on the ground with people and looking at what they're doing, I then try to be an advocate for those things that move as close to that as possible. And if they're not close, at least they're not moving backwards. They're moving in the right direction. And I don't want to ever be confused about that. I just don't know how I could go from the role that I have played for over 50 years to being an elected official in there doing the compromising that would have to be done. I want good people to be there. And I know that they're not going to do everything I want them to do, but that's not going to keep me from saying what needs to happen. It's not going to keep me from calling them out when they don't do it. It's not going to keep me from pushing them when they don't quite get there. And so I do think, in answer to your question, that we're not clear enough about the roles that have to be played for the change that happens. Too often we see a scrappy person in community with leadership really doing that organizing. The first thing we want to do is pull them out and put them someplace else where they can't be that person. That we'll see somebody who's really good and pushing hard in a corporation, making change in that corporation, and we pull them out and put them in a foundation. You know, we don't have a good sense of what kind of person it takes to be able to be in these different entities and push to go forward.
People need to know their lane. That's what you're saying. Need to play their position.
Play it, but really play it. Not just act it out, really play it.
Okay, all right. And I'm curious about how you talked about two different things here. I read your article on curb cuts. And so can you give us a quick synopsis of what your position is on and why you thought that was a great example to embody things that you care about?
I talked earlier about the changing demographics. And back in 2010, when it became really obvious that we were becoming a nation that would be people of color sooner than people were thinking at that time, it was also the time that we were in a deep recession and the economy was front and center and everybody was talking about inequality. We were having in 2011 the conversation about the 1% and the 99. And I thought that inequality discussion would be short-lived, but it hasn't been. It has continued. It's gotten more sophisticated, it's gotten more data, it's gotten more refined. But we understand that we're living in a time of toxic inequality that's hollowing out the middle class, baking in poverty, stalling economic mobility. At that time, my friend Monroe Pastor, who's at USC, and we started talking about how to be able to blend these two things together. And what we concluded is the equity agenda, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, really is the economic agenda. That if we could get equity right, we would get the economy right. We said, equity is the superior growth model. And boy, that was a catchy phrase. We started talking about it. I started giving it in speeches. We did a lot. One of the things that we did is we put together the National Equity Atlas, which you can find on the PolicyLink website, which is fascinating. It has three things. It has changing demographics from 1980 to 2050, disaggregated by race, by the nation, the 50 largest states, the 150 largest regions, the 100 largest cities. Then it has about 33 economic indicators, median wage, education levels, distance to work, broken down by race or the same geography. But the punchline is the third one that looks at what the GDP would be if we got rid of racial differences in income. Doesn't mean everybody makes the same, but the bell curve, there are no racial differences. In 2017, it would have been $2.8 trillion higher. That makes the point that equity is the superior growth model. But when I talked about it, I often found that it wasn't the applause line I thought it should be. You kind of know how to judge what's happening by, I need a better way to say this. And then one day I was sitting in the green room waiting to go on, and I thought, I don't want to say equity is superior growth model this time. I want to say something else. I need something people can relate to. And I thought, aha, the curb cut. The cutouts in the sidewalk are there because of advocacy of people with disabilities in wheelchairs. And yet, there's hardly a person who moves around who hasn't benefited from it in some way. Pushing a stroller, pulling a wagon, pushing a cart, trying to catch a train with those rollies behind you, even thinking about your 7-year-old new bike rider traversing the neighborhood sidewalk to sidewalk. The curb cut shows that when you solve problems with nuance and specificity, for those who are most vulnerable and marginalized, the benefits cascade to everybody. Boom. You know what you're looking for? It's every place. So I'm gonna give you two quick examples. One is not smoking on airplanes. It started because not smoking in public places. It started because flight attendants wanted to get smoking banned on airplanes. Finally, when they hooked up with Ralph Nader, that great consumer advocate, they were able to get it banned. They were the most vulnerable people in terms of being in that closed situation with smoke. They couldn't get away from it. Once it was banned on airplanes, it began a movement to ban smoking in public places. Think of the millions of lives that have been saved. Here's another one, the GI Bill. The GI Bill started because people thought that of the 16 million returning veterans from World War II, about 100,000 of them may have trouble getting integrated back into community. And so they designed the GI Bill for that 100,000. And I call the GI Bill the would-be gold standard of the curb cut effect. Would be because it was administered in a discriminatory way. So it didn't do it for everybody because so many Black people got cut out of it and others. But the GI Bill made the white middle class. Of those 16 million returning veterans, over 8 million took advantage of the educational opportunities. Many more took advantage of the mortgage opportunities. Nobel Prize winners, senators, educators, lawyers. It's amazing. Solve problems with nuance and specificity for those who are most vulnerable, marginalized, discriminated against, however you want to label it, and the benefits cascade to everybody. So that's the way I began to make the point that equity is superior growth model.
I love that marketing, but let me let me give you a different reason why the GDP might not have been a huge applause line.
Yeah, I can think of many of this. The environmentalists, they pushed back on me right away. But I also think that if you really think about equity, even those people who are concerned about the environment know the people who were hurt first and worst by the degradations of the environment or people of color. So if you actually are applying equity, you will get a lot of things right. But I do know that it's not.
let me like now turn it a little bit, because more recently in your writings, you said at one point, the quote, privileges must be abandoned, right? That's not curb cuts, right? Curb cuts are, nobody loses anything. It's all gain all the way through. There's no cost to anyone. But when you start talking about closing gaps, right? And this is what you're talking about when you talk about equity. So it brings us back to where we started at the beginning, right? You're not talking about lifting all boats. You're talking about closing the gaps and the ability to flourish, right? That society should make it possible for everyone to flourish, and it's not happening right now. So there are gaps that need to be closed. And the distinction between the curb cut example, which is that's cost-free and there's only benefit, and now the language you're using where like privileges must be abandoned, there's a wide gap between those two things, even though the outcomes, I think what you'd like to see in the society are the same. How do you go about transitioning from your loser of an applause line to your curb cut, which is a great applause line, right? To back to what I would argue, I'd be surprised if privileges must be abandoned is going to be a huge applause line. Like, how do you think about moving now to this true equity focused approach?
Yes, when you live in a society such as ours that's become really imbalanced, you are not going to be able to tell people that no one's going to have to change, that nobody's going to have to give up. You know, we are not a poor country, and we need to stop acting like one. Wealthiest country on the face of the earth, and yet we talk about austerity. We allow children to go to schools that are horrible, people to live in terrible conditions, homelessness all around. We're not a poor country. We need to stop acting like one. And when we look at the people who are really wealthy, when we look at the 50 people who have the wealth of nations, when we look at how much wealth that some people have, they need to give some of that up. But they'll still flourish. They may do better. You know, we are not talking about putting them homeless. We're just talking about how much do you really need? And what happened to patriotism? What happened to the notion that you live in a country that allows you to do well and you put back as gratitude, but to keep that country strong and to be able to have a steady stream of creators and consumers and all of that. Yes, some people really do need to pay more taxes. Some people really need to pay more taxes. You know, we've got Prop 15 on the ballot where we're trying to talk about for the money that we need for schools, we need to be taxing commercial property and not putting all the burden on residential property. But even in doing that, there is concern about small business people. Businesses 3 million or more are exempt. And only 10% of the wealthiest businesses would be paying 92% of the new revenue. So, you know, there is a way to do this thoughtfully. But yeah, somebody has to give something up. But the people we're asking to give up, they have too much. They have too much. And the American people are so protective of those people who have enormous weight. The wealth of nations are held by individuals. The American people don't need to be protecting that. And those people should be the main ones speaking out and giving back to a country that has allowed them to accumulate so much through a system like that. Yes, some people are going to have to give something up, but here's the other thing. Privilege gets used in a lot of ways these days. You and I were just talking about it, at least I was talking about it in terms of people who have extraordinary wealth and they are not paying their fair share. But there's another way that privilege gets used, that people talk about white privilege, and they talk about understanding that people who move through this society as white people have privileges that people who are Black and Latinx and others don't have. I think we need to be a little more thoughtful about that discussion, because I actually think a lot of what we call privilege in that discussion is not privilege at all. It's race discrimination. If you think about it, if you're white and you are able to walk through a store where you intend to buy something and you are not followed, and somebody who is Black comes in money in her pocket and she plans to buy something, but she is followed. The fact that you are not followed is not a privilege. The fact that that person is followed is race-based discrimination. And we shouldn't be dressing it up as privilege. We need to talk about it as what it is. The same thing, I've heard people talk about white privilege in terms of white people with teenage sons not having to worry about their safety when they go out on a Saturday night. And we know that so many Black families are just sitting there just hoping their child is going to come home safely. The person who doesn't have to worry, that's not a privilege. If somebody's child is not safe for no other reason than because they're Black or they have an accent, that is race discrimination. So we need to get clear in this privilege discussion about the discrimination that is happening in society. And we all need to make sure that we get rid of that discrimination. We're not getting rid of privilege. We are getting rid of the discrimination. And when we're using privilege to talk about wealth, the wealthy, the very wealthy, need to pay their fair share.
Yeah, here I'm gonna push back a little bit because I do some research on this one. And this is like, it's not marketing. There's a psychology, a psychological phenomenon here that I think is important. So the reason I think you should talk about white privilege is because when you talk about just discrimination, which I don't, just as you described it, I don't disagree at all. Completely agree with everything you said. When you only talk about it in terms of discrimination, it allows white folks to feel like we should fix that for them. Like, that is not fair that they are being treated that way, but there's no self-implication. So the value of talking about privilege is to say that this is a system that we all participate in, and it's not possible for this system to affect just one person. If there is race-based discrimination against Black folks, against Latinx folks, then that must mean you're implicated. That doesn't mean you did it. That doesn't mean you're responsible for creating it. That means you are a participant in it in some way and it affects you, and you have a moral responsibility in that sense to engage in trying to fix that. Because if you don't have the sense that I'm engaged in it, that I'm involved in it, that I'm implicated in it, then there's no real moral obligation to fix it. You might see it as a charitable thing to do. You know, it might feel good to help someone else, but you feel less psychologically on the hook than you do if you think of it as like, I am in some way benefiting from this inequitable system. So I would push. And so it's not that I think we shouldn't talk about discrimination. I think we should. I don't think we should hide that. But I also think we have to have some way of describing what it means to be in a high-powered position in an inequitable system.
And I agree with you. And I don't want to push back on what you said. I want to go into it deeper, because I agree with you that people need to understand that they are complicit in what is going on. You didn't use that word. You walked right up to it. I'm not sure why you didn't use it, but they are complicit in what is going on. And I'm not sure that privilege suggests complicity. And I suspect that if people who aren't in the business of social change, and so often, these words get out into the broader society, we start them off in the social change community and then they just get out there, that if people think that they're having to give up their privilege, it seems to me it might be harder to draw them in. But I do think that people have to understand that this hurts everybody. A system that only uses 60% of the talent that we have in the nation hurts the nation because we're missing 40%. That people who are aging white and think the way that they are going to retire is they're going to sell their homes, when they understand that the median age for white people is 42 and the median age for people who are Latinx is 28, if the people who are younger or the ones who need families are not able to buy those homes, that retirement is not going to materialize. If people understand that the people who you hope can help you with your elder care, if they have to live 2 hours away in order to be able to come to where you are with your elderly parent who you need help for so you can go to work, that doesn't work. I think we need to think about those things that bind us together in the economy so that we all understand that we are all hurt if we don't get this right. And we don't want to be complicit in continuing this discrimination because it is going to hurt you financially. And if you are someone who understands that it's going to hurt you because you hate to be the person who is benefiting from such a system, I think I can get you anyway. I can get you anyway. I am more worried about the people. There's that dog. I'm more worried about the people who are not in this business, don't think about it that way, and need to have some very concrete things that help them see this is going to be good for everyone.
Yeah, I think I hear you, and I agree with that. My concern is it shapes the nature of the problem, and it doesn't. And the solution, though, is the one that was what you really care about, right? And the problem, though, if people see that as the problem, it doesn't guarantee they're going to come to the same solution, right?
Mhm.
So they could see, like, you're right, this is not working for me, and I need to fix this. So the problem statement is right, but in the past, the way this country has solved those types of problems has not necessarily generated more equity.
Mhm.
So that's a
That's
little
why
more
I say
concern.
I join you. I pay a lot of attention to words, and I know that what you say and how you say it makes such a difference. And I also know that we won't get rid of racism and discrimination and become a fully inclusive, equitable society. We won't become an anti-racist nation unless a whole lot more people see that this is the way to go.
Yeah.
And that is what I'm struggling with every day, how to help more people see it and join in.
Yeah. Well, all I can say is I'm impressed. Like, so I love the energy. I love the approach. So I'm happy you're out there playing your position.
Yeah.
um, what would you tell the young people listening right now? So we have a lot of young people, a lot of GSB students. So people who are leaders and aspire to go out and continue to lead and engage with the world in important ways. What would you leave them with?
I love the young people. They are my heroes. They are my heroes. I love so many things about them. And so part of what I want to say is don't let who you are get separated from your civic responsibilities, from government, from politics, because who they are is so exciting. The way that they react to difference, the way that they are so inclusive. And I'm not talking about everybody, but the ones that I'm often coming in contact with. I mean, I'm Angela Blackwell, and my pronouns are she, her. I mean, that is just wonderful to be able to constantly be finding ways to reach out and include. I was on a webinar recently, and someone said, we should all describe ourselves so that people who are visually impaired will be able to have a sense of who's here. And we all did. And that was a first for me. I hadn't done that before. So there's that piece. There's also this piece of uh, transformative solidarity. Young people are demonstrating transformative solidarity. It's what we were just talking about, that we are in this together because we are in this together. It's not allyship. It is like we are together. I'm not an ally in your problem. It is our problem. Black Lives Matter, and I'm going to put my white light out there on the line to show you that it does. What we saw in the early months, in the spring and the summer, and it's continuing on. You're just not seeing it on the news anymore. Extraordinary. That's young people. The other thing that young people are doing is that they don't have these sharp lines. I see so many young people who understand the economy and they want to go into business and they want to do it in a way that's going to be making a contribution. They want their businesses to be things that respond to community problems. They want to do it in exciting ways, talking about cooperatives, talking about how they share resources. I love that. And so I am excited. I think that a lot of what we want, this next generation is going to produce. It's just so important that they vote, that they understand that politics make a difference, that they understand that service in government is a good and noble thing to do if you're going to do it well. And don't throw away those people who feel differently. Talk to them. You know, I know people aren't going to be gathering this Thanksgiving the way that they often do, but there have been times when people have dreaded going home to families that don't share their view. And I think that's really chicken. I think you need to go in there, you need to talk about what's on your mind, bring others along. I love young people.
Great. I love that. I have one more question for you. What's your superpower?
Ooh, turn around, fair play, right? Um, Listening. I really do think that I am often able to hear what people say and hear beneath what they say. And it allows me to be able to translate what it is that they're wanting and make a connection. I think if I have a superpower, it is the ability to really listen. I try.
I love that because it was a pleasure to listen to you. So
Thanks.
I love that superpower. Thank you so much for taking the time. Really, really appreciate it. It was great.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.